Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our newest webinar installment, One Water Perspectives. We are excited to hear from thought leaders, regional managers, policymakers, and practitioners from across the country, and are eager to learn more about their local accomplishments, lessons learned, and activities currently underway in their region. We are delighted to continue our series today with a presentation from Dr. Doug Yoder, member of the UN Southeast Florida Regional Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Please be sure to tune in next week when we head up the East Coast to learn about climate resilient water management from Alan Cohn, New York City's Managing Director for Integrated Water Management in the Department of Environmental Protection. For those of you that are new to our webinar series, I want to cover a couple quick housekeeping items. First, we are recording each webinar and posting them to our YouTube channel. A link will be added to the UN webinar webpage and disseminated as soon as it's available. Second, all participants have entered this webinar muted, so please enter your questions into the chat queue, and I'll be monitoring these throughout the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. Barring any technical difficulties, I will unmute the question askers so they can connect directly with Dr. Yoder. And with that, I am excited to introduce our presenter for this afternoon, Dr. Douglas Yoder, the Deputy Director of Miami-Dade's Water and Sewer Department, the largest utility in the state of Florida, and one of the 10 largest utilities in the United States. Prior to moving to the Water and Sewer Department, he worked for nearly 30 years with the county's Environmental Resources Management Department, with responsibilities for oversight of utility operations, water resource management, and water quality protection. He has served 2 terms on the National Drinking Water Advisory Council, served on the Climate Ready Utilities Working Group, the board of the Water Research Foundation, and the Water Resources Advisory Commission. He currently serves on the board of the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies and the Waterways Advisory Board of the City of Coral Gables. He holds a bachelor's degree in government from Cornell University and a master's and doctoral degree in public administration from Nova Southeastern University, and has lived in Florida since 1970. And with that, I'm going to let Dr. Yoder take it away. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to spend a little time with you. I can report that it's a beautiful spring day here, about 80 degrees with a light wind. So it's a nice day in Florida. Hopefully it's a nice day wherever you are. I'm going to spend some time talking about our approach to adaptive management, in particularly as it relates to the consequences of climate change and sea level rise. And I'm beginning here with a kind of a locator slide that gives you a bit of a lay of the land in South Florida. I'll use my mouse and pointer here to identify a few of the features that define the environment in which we operate. You can see Miami down here right on the southeast coast, and Fort Lauderdale a little further up the way, and Palm Beach County up the way. That whole coast area is kind of known as the Gold Coast, I think in part for its attractiveness as a tourist destination. But you see a lot more on this map that defines the historic Everglades Basin. This is a drainage basin that goes way up into central Florida. Water flows south into Lake Okeechobee, oftentimes called the liquid heart of the Everglades system. Immediately south of Lake Okeechobee, you see a thing called the EAA, which is the Everglades agricultural area, an area of very rich soils that has supported most of the sugarcane industry in Florida for many years. South of that, you see these water conservation areas, which are all owned by the state and which are used to store water so that it doesn't spill over into the urbanized area, which is all of that sort of green strip along the coast. At the very end, you see Everglades National Park and the Big Cypress National Preserve. not actually shown on this map, but located right along the edge of Biscayne Bay, is Biscayne National Park. So we have here in Miami-Dade County 2 national parks, one to our west and one to our east. You also see all of these little lines, some of which go all the way back up to Lake Okeechobee, which are drainage canals. I always make the point that the 3 things that have contributed to the development of Southeast Florida are, of course, sunshine, second, drainage, and third, air conditioning. And without any of those, any one of those things, why, it would be a far different place than it currently is. I point out in passing that I'll talk in a bit about the 4-county compact, the 4 counties comprising Palm Beach County, Broward, which is Fort Lauderdale, Miami-Dade, which is Miami, and Monroe, which is the Florida Keys that go down here all the way to the point of Key West, have created an organization to specifically collaborate on climate change issues. And that has proven to be an effective tool that may be useful to you all in your particular situations. The Water and Sewer Department was created back in 1972 when the County Commission really determined that effective economic development in the county was not so likely to happen with a whole lot of utilities. And so the county system merged with the City of Miami system, which was the oldest of the water and sewer utilities, to create one large utility. As a part of that effort, all of the investor-owned utilities, and several existed at the time, were bought by the county. So there are currently no investor-owned utilities in operation. There are a number of municipal utilities, most of which buy their water and sewer services on a wholesale basis from our department. You can see there we have about 2,800 positions on staff, and our operating budget about $780 million, and an ambitious capital budget as well. And just some of the statistics about our water supply system. We produce right now about 320 million gallons of water per day. We have over 7,000 miles of water mains. So we are definitely a regional utility. You'll note our per capita consumption there is 136 gallons per person per day. 10 years ago, that was about 155 gallons per person per day. So we have had an effective water conservation program to meet some of our future water supply needs. On the wastewater side, you'll see we have 3 coastal wastewater plants, 2 of which currently use ocean outfalls to dispose of treated effluent, and the third uses deep injection wells. A few years ago, the state passed a law that requires that we stop using the ocean outfalls by 2025, and that we reuse about 60% of the water that was going out of the outfalls. That's about a $5 billion project or set of projects for us to do. You'll also note down at the bottom here that we are currently operating, as many utilities are, under a federal consent decree that is primarily focused on the aging infrastructure, much of which was built in the 1970s, right after the Clean Water Act came into effect, and provided a substantial amount funding to build 2 of the 3 wastewater treatment plants that we currently operate. A little map here that shows where our facilities are located. You can see that the 3 coastal wastewater treatment plants, one of which, right off of downtown, the oldest of the facilities that was originally built in the mid-1950s, is located conveniently on a barrier island, not unlike the facility in Boston Harbor on Deer Island, for any of you who may be from up in that neck of the woods. It does create a certain vulnerability to storm surge and hurricanes, which we'll talk about some more. You'll notice that our water facilities are all located inland, in addition to which we have well fields that are much further inland. And that was done in particular in recognition of risks from saltwater intrusion. That's not the case so much in some of the cities to the north of us up in Broward County, which still have a few coastal well fields that can get salt intruded, particularly in the winter dry season. This is a little schematic of our groundwater system. We operate completely on groundwater. You see a bunch of drainage canals here that ultimately discharge into Biscayne Bay to move water from the land to the bay. You see what looks like a mountain range here, which is what we call the coastal ridge, although the highest point of the coastal ridge is maybe 15 feet above sea level, so there's a little distortion in the portrayal here. The Biscayne aquifer is our surficial aquifer, and it interacts very directly with the bay and the ocean because it is underlain by a highly transmissive limestone known as the Miami-Dade, which means that you have to maintain a high enough elevation of the water table, maybe a foot above sea level, to keep the salt water from intruding into the system. These water supply wells are extremely productive. You can get 10 million gallons a day out of a single well in some cases. So it is, and the water is very clean. We provide lime softening to remove the hardness of the water. In some instances, we just disinfect the water and distribute it. So it's a highly productive system, but it is part of the Everglades system. And we are now constrained in terms of taking more water. So we actually do have one facility that has wells that go down to about 1,000 feet, well below the Biscayne aquifer, to a brackish aquifer called the Floridan aquifer. And that requires a reverse osmosis treatment to take the salt out of it. So it's a much more expensive source of water. That's a picture of the Miami-Dade. That's usually characterized as either a sponge or a Swiss cheese, if you prefer. But it's easy to see from looking at that picture why the drainage works so well, why the water is, so much water can be stored, and also why this system is susceptible to contamination from activities on the ground, because anything that spills on the ground can very easily get into the drinking water supply. So we have a very stringent wellfield protection ordinance that limits the kinds of activities that can occur in proximity to our water supply wells. So I want to talk a little bit about resiliency, and one of my observations is Resiliency is kind of another name for the preparation that utilities have historically taken, I think, to be able to provide service continuously. You always hear about in the Postal Service that the mail always goes through, and I think there is actually a similar culture among utility operators and utility workers in particular, that they have a special obligation to continue to provide services even under very difficult circumstances. I always take the opportunity to make the point that nothing much else happens in an urban environment unless there are effective and reliable utility services available to protect public health and to support the economy. And all of us in the business know that we oftentimes don't get recognized very much, partly because our infrastructure is, for the most part, out of sight. But I think also partly because utilities have, in this country, been so reliable for such a long period of time that people just totally take that level of service for granted. But I would also say that utility engineering has, for a long time, been very cognizant of the need to enable resilience. And so designs are done in a way that some people might characterize as overbuilding, but when the storm comes, or when the tornado comes, or the earthquake, you're glad that somebody took the time to over-design. So everybody has a different set of vulnerabilities, which may be particular to the part of the country that you live in. And certainly everybody is aware of the fact that in Southeast Florida, hurricanes and tropical storm activities are the historic challenges that we've had over time. And so those involve typically storm surge and event-related flooding, wind, of course, chronic flooding if the drainage system fails to work properly, and if there is an extended period of time with a lot of rain. We've had up to 20 inches of rain or more in a 24-hour period, and it has caused some event flooding, but it hasn't really caused chronic flooding in that part of the county that is the beneficiary of the regional drainage system. Saltwater intrusion is always a challenge, and has been ever since the drainage system was built, and it has to be managed very carefully to make sure that saltwater intrusion doesn't occur. And I've included here customer and demand stability over time. There are emerging concerns about what our future may hold in terms of the habitability of parts of the Southeast, and particularly the coastal Southeast, as a result of sea level rise. But some of you may have experienced the problem of declining customer demand, either as a result of particular events like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, or economic issues that have caused people to leave. Florida, really since it began to be developed in a serious way after 1900, has never experienced a population decline, to my knowledge. And so this is kind of a new idea that people would actually leave. We have, of course, experienced slowdowns, but even after this last recession, it really didn't take very long before you saw construction cranes being redeployed. There was a study done by the Organization for Community and Economic Development a few years ago that took a look at worldwide vulnerability to sea level rise. And I always bring this slide out when people start talking about how well their sports teams are doing and how poorly Miami's sports teams are doing, so that I can demonstrate that at least we're number one in something. And in this case, we are rated number one in terms of the value of assets that are vulnerable to the consequences of sea level rise of all the cities in the world, even ahead of New York. We're down at number 9 there in terms of the number of people, the population that are exposed. So we don't have as many people, but we have a lot of valuable assets. So this is a reminder that that we have a particular set of issues that we need to be dealing with. So just in terms of analyzing how we can create greater resiliency in light of what kind of sea level rise and associated storm surge and flooding problems may occur as a result. We've done a couple of things. One is that we have undertaken very substantial modeling efforts, both for storm surge analysis and for predicting how saltwater intrusion may occur as a function of sea level rise. And in the storm surge analysis, we were able to use the actual experience that we had from Hurricane Andrew in 1992 that gave us actual storm surge elevations from a Category 5 hurricane that was over 165 miles an hour. And we were able to use that data to predict what storm surge elevations would occur with hurricanes coming from different directions relative to our vulnerable facilities, which are, as you recall, primarily our 3 regional sewer plants. Now this slide is kind of turned on its side, so north is to the left and east, the ocean, is to the top. But you can see that this zone is the area that was predicted to be flooded as a result of storm surge in this modeling. And you can see our treatment plants, all, of course, within those very vulnerable locations. This is just this is a photo of our oldest plant, the Central District plant, which is just offshore from downtown Miami, and it's fairly pronounced on this barrier island. It's called Virginia Key. I can note in passing that Fisher Island, located just across the way, it was reported in the paper today, is the wealthiest zip code in the United States. And this is truly an island. If you live here, you have to take a ferry boat that goes back and forth to Miami, to this causeway near Miami Beach. And this is our seaport. But you can see from the location of this plant that this is exposed directly to the Atlantic Ocean. So this would be our worst case, most vulnerable facility. This is a little bit of a busy chart that shows the result of the storm surge modeling that we've done, looking at on the vertical axis here, elevation of each of the component facilities at that Central District plant. You can see that they They range from a low of about 11 feet up to a high of about 18 feet. And the storm surges associated with different, currently, and then different levels of sea level rise that range from, as I recall, about a foot to about 3 feet, a little over 3 feet, that we are predicting may occur by 2075. And within each of these scenarios, you can see the storm surge elevation associated with different categories of hurricanes. So under current conditions, a Category 1 hurricane would likely result in a 7-foot storm surge, but by 2075, that would be more likely a 10-foot. And so you see in order to be really protected from a Category 5 hurricane with that 3+ foot elevation in sea level, you'd need to be up in the 21, 22 feet range with your facilities if your primary approach to protecting the facilities is to elevate them. The difference is that now our facilities become vulnerable in a Category 3 storm, but with sea level rise, they would become vulnerable in a Category 2 storm, according to this modeling effort. So this is kind of a way of understanding what is likely to happen as we get a better idea of how much sea level rise is actually going to occur. The effort to forecast saltwater intrusion is reflected on this map, and again you can see all of the canals that are in here, and there are these little boxes are the structures that control the elevation of the water in the canal system. The dotted red line is the current salt intrusion line at the base of the Biscayne aquifer, and the solid red line is what our modeling predicts will be occurring as sea level rises, and this was done with about 1.2 feet of sea level rise, which is expected in 2040. So you can see that we're in relatively good shape in that regard, but we do start seeing movement down in the southern part of the county, which has always been the most vulnerable because it is getting the least amount of water delivered to it from the regional water management system. So the conclusion is that any water supply well fields down here are going to be at greater risk than they will be in the central and northern part of the county. Now, of course, you can mitigate risk in this instance by providing more treatment to take salt out of the water. So even if salt intrusion does occur to the point where it begins to affect things, it might first be a matter of moving well fields further west, but it also eventually might be a matter of changing the system of treatment. So as we have done this planning, and I would say that we have probably spent over the last 8 or 9 years, maybe $10 million on doing that modeling work. We have developed design guidelines both for our wastewater plants on the coast, which we are substantially rebuilding at this point because of the consent decree work that I had mentioned, and also the work that we have to do to discontinue using our ocean outfalls. So that represents an opportunity that you might not have, because you can do things when you're spending money anyway and make them more resilient as you do that. We've also done a design guide for our pump stations. We have over 1,000 pump stations in the sewer system because we are so flat that nothing moves without being pumped. So some of those facilities also are in coastal areas and in flood hazard areas, and we want to try to make those more resilient by protecting, in particular, the control systems and the electrical systems, which are most vulnerable to storm surge and flooding. You just saw the picture there about what we're seeing in salt intrusion and the flooding model and so on. We are also, as part of our effort to deal with climate change, trying to be more energy efficient. We already and have for a long time produced electricity from the biogas that's produced at the wastewater plants. We recently, because we are conveniently located next door to a landfill, have been using the methane from the landfill also to power generators. And we're looking at the idea with our local electric utility of deploying solar panels on some lakes that were created on our plant sites when the plant sites were built and the lakes were dredged for fill material. So that may help a little bit. I had mentioned the 4-county climate compact that was created about 10 years ago that provides an opportunity for planners and operators from all 4 counties to meet on a regular basis, to have a single forecast for what sea level rise is going to be over time. We have been able to attract some grant funding that we probably would not have otherwise gotten. Miami-Dade County, along with the City of Miami and Miami Beach, are part of the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities program. All of the counties, plus Miami and Miami Beach, now have chief resilience officers whose job it is really to go well beyond what utilities are doing to incorporate measures to mitigate sea level rise across all of the infrastructure in the region. So far, the work that we've done has indicated that we're probably going to end up maybe paying about a 5% premium as we rebuild our infrastructure to significantly improve its resilience over time, either by elevating that infrastructure where that's feasible, or by hardening it, or simply by instituting operational practices where we may keep more spare parts available so that if we actually lose something, we can replace it quickly. This is just an example of something that we have actually done at our Central District plant. This low building that you see was used to store chlorine, in this case elemental or gaseous chlorine in cylinders, compressed under pressure in cylinders. And this is the new chlorine facility where we have changed away from elemental chlorine, which is very dangerous to work with, to hypochlorite, which is basically like bleach, so it requires bigger storage facilities. But the design guideline here was that this parapet along the elevated floor of the facility, you can see, is about at the roof height of the old facility. And so this is a very direct response to the modeling work that we did and to the design guidelines that we put together to try to make this facility more resilient to the storm surges that we know will be coming at some point in the future, with the additional impact of sea level rise. I don't know how there could be rain here. This picture was taken in January, which was the dry season. I should mention also the fairly well-known phenomenon now on Miami Beach, which is called blue sky flooding, where their drainage system on high tides allows seawater to back up into the streets. So the water that you see here did not come from a storm event or a hurricane. It came from salt water backing up into the streets. And you may likely be aware of the fact that the city is spending over $500 million to try to rectify that situation by raising the elevation of streets and by putting in pump stations to pump the stormwater out and to preclude the ocean water to come back in on high tides. This is really the direct experience that people have had that I think has resulted in a great deal of public support for the county and the other government jurisdictions to deal with sea level rise, because this did not used to happen. And you see here a nice statement from now the former mayor, Philip Levine of Miami Beach, who has shown a lot of leadership here, and he's currently running for governor. I'm going to take just a few minutes to run through some slides about Hurricane Irma, because no tour of South Florida would be complete without having a hurricane experience of some sort, although the Chamber of Commerce doesn't like to dwell on that. This was a hurricane that we worried about a lot, and you can see in this hurricane track where it actually went that it was a very strong Category 5 hurricane coming through the Caribbean Basin, and when it came up near Cuba and then crossed the Florida Keys, it was actually a Category 4 right here. And then it jogged a little bit because just before the storm, there was still speculation that it was going to go up the East Coast and possibly go right through downtown Miami. And as hurricanes sometimes do, it jogged just enough so that it went through Naples. This is a picture of it after it crossed the Florida Keys, and you can see that it is so large that it covers the entire state of Florida and most of Cuba. So, and one of its features was that it didn't move very fast. So we were experiencing here in Miami conditions that caused this sort of similar or familiar hurricane type picture. The highest winds were 99 miles an hour, but the wind stayed for about 12 hours. And that resulted in tremendous loss of power throughout most of the state of Florida. This is a reminder that it isn't always a good idea to shelter your vehicle under a tree. The uprooting of trees is a serious problem with respect to water mains and service lines. Down in the Keys, they had so many broken service lines that their water plant, which is actually in Dade County, Miami-Dade County, couldn't pump water any further than Marathon because so much of it was leaking out. And it took them about 10 days to get water back into operation. Even then, it wasn't potable. It was just water you could take a shower with. This was just in downtown Miami in the highly now developed Brickell area, where water overtopped the seawalls that are a block or two away from here and flooded the streets. So it was pretty photogenic for the Weather Channel guy. This was all gone the next day. This is a little bit of damage that we had to one of the roofs on our clarifiers out at Virginia Key at the Central District plant. Not serious damage, but some damage. And you can see this was the next day, and it was a very nice day the next day. We had a couple of doors that took some damage, but it really was not consequential. The big deal was the loss of power for everybody, but it was all back within 10 days. It was an incredible effort on the part of the power company. We had a crew from Madison, Wisconsin that restored the power at our house after a week. But think about that as compared to what happened to Puerto Rico after Maria, where they still don't have power back. We didn't lose any service to any of our water or sewer customers. We had a problem with a transfer pump that supplied fuel to one of our generators, and it caused the generator to go out and power to be lost to the pump. And so we lost some sewage into Biscayne Bay, but it was treated sewage, so that was not as bad as it could have been. We are able to operate our entire system off the grid, which is rule number one in any hurricane-prone area. You won't survive very long if you are dependent on electricity from your power provider in a hurricane. So a few insights here about resiliency. The key point is that, of course, we don't really know what the new normal is. All of our planning in the past was based on a static set of conditions, and we know now that static is no longer applicable. And so the whole idea of adaptive management under these circumstances is to time investments and the measures that you take for resiliency to the expected useful life of the particular asset that you're dealing with. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot of money on something now that is designed to deal with a situation 50 years from now if the lifespan of that particular asset is only going to be 20 years. Because in 20 years, you're going to have a much better idea of what really is going to happen in the future. There is a lot of research that has been done by the various research and policy associations. That's a good thing to be mindful of and participate in. Certainly the regional partnerships that we've been involved with are critical. Even the state and the federal government may eventually get on board with this, as both Florida and the federal governments were in the past and have been less so now. I think it's important that utilities realize that they can't do this planning in isolation. We have, because of the particular work that we've needed to do to restore our assets, we have ended up kind of taking a lead, and a lot of the modeling work that we have been done is being used by all of the other county departments and other entities up the way to use as a basis for making decisions about their infrastructure. So it's important that utilities not sort of go off on their own, I think, but engage thoroughly with all of the other stakeholders who are going to be part of the solution. I think the one thing that is very difficult for elected officials, particularly, to deal with, is the idea that some places just can't be protected. And for us, this relates to the extent to which the regional drainage system, which is operated by the South Florida Water Management District, which is a state agency that has jurisdiction over that entire area that I showed on the introductory map. And they operate the canal system and they manage Lake Okeechobee, and their ability to continue to provide drainage as sea level rises is going to be very challenging, because much of that system operates on the basis of gravity, and the downhill is beginning to disappear as sea level rises. So that is, in my mind, the biggest challenge that we have. If that's done, then we can take care of the utilities and a lot of the other infrastructure. If it's not done, we will have a lot of people picking up and leaving, because they're not going to withstand weekly or daily flooding that results every time either the tide comes in or rain falls. This is a piece from Rolling Stone magazine from a couple of years ago that pronounced Miami dead as a result of sea level rise. And again, it is sort of illustrative of one of the difficulties, kind of a psychological difficulty of trying to deal with this sort of problem, because there are some number of people who will come to the conclusion that nothing can be saved and therefore nothing should be done. And that can be a formidable obstacle to rational decision making. So finally, we're reminded that everybody needs a place for a safe harbor in a storm and a place to rest. And so this guy found a rock in Biscayne Bay where he could get a little piece from Irma after it went through. These are some locations you might want to check, where you can see in more detail some of the things that we've done at our website, Miami-Dade.gov water, that the county has done with kind of green resiliency planning. And this is the website of the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, and you can see what has been done there. And that's my email address, so anybody who wants to get in touch with me can. And Sarah, I think that's my cue to turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Well, we've had a couple questions trickle in over the span of the presentation. I suspect there might be a couple more as we start this discussion. So I'm going to make that attempt to turn some microphones on here. And I'm going to start with Carrie. Let's see if this works.
Hi,
Hey,
my
Carrie?
name is Carrie. Yes, I'm there.
We can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Doug. That was a wonderful presentation, and it seems like you have some really significant challenges and opportunities that you're working with in Miami. I was curious if the utility had considered, and for any kind of pieces of its resiliency planning, found natural infrastructure or green infrastructure approaches appropriate, and if not, why not? If so, what piece were they most best suited for?
Well, we actually have done that a little bit. There's at our South District plant, which is a bit further inland from the edge of the bay, we have done some work to look at the effect of enhancing the mangrove forest that is there as a way of moderating the storm surge that would otherwise impact the plant. And that, I don't think that is going to substitute for raising the elevation of facilities and doing some hardening at the facilities, but it can make a difference. So that's one example. I think we don't have as much need, in a way, to do some of the kind of typical green infrastructure things for, let's say, separating stormwater from wastewater. We don't have a combined sewer system, so that's not a problem that we're dealing with. We do deal with the problem that most of our gravity sewers are actually in the groundwater, and as sea level rises and groundwater levels rise, that's going to be an impact in terms of inflow and infiltration.
Great, thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to move down to James Heaney. Let's see if we can get his microphone on. Can you give it a try? Oh. Well, I don't think we can hear you, but I'll go ahead and read your question, and you can try and pipe up if your mic turns on. Oh, I think we got you. Are you there? Okay, well, I'll just go ahead and read his question. So he's wondering about the impacts of the Everglade restoration modeling on your storm surge modeling activities.
Well, I'm not aware that there is direct impact one way or the other. The Everglades, the restoration of the Everglades depends on getting water to critical parts of the Everglades of the right quality at the right time. And this whole puzzle of water management in South Florida is a difficult one. It's probably one of the most managed water systems anywhere in the world. And the problem is, part of the historic Everglades is on the eastern coastline. I'm just running back to my first chart here. The area that is now part of Biscayne National Park, there are coastal wetlands that were part of the historic Everglades, and of course, a lot of it is further to the west and to the south. And so, what you are trying to do is keep water levels generally high to the west, high to the east for these coastal wetlands, but low in the middle where everybody lives, and where farming also occurs. And so it's like trying to have the middle of the bathtub low and each end high. So it's a real challenge. But of course, it's also true that sea level rise is going to have a dramatic impact on what happens to the Everglades, because areas that were estuaries and kind of saltwater or freshwater marshes are going to become saltwater marshes, and nothing is going to be the same.
Well, I think that's a really good segue into another question. Jean, I'm going to try and turn your mic on. Jean, can you try giving us a shout? Well, not sure if that one's working. Oh, are you there? Okay. So Jean was wondering if the results from the sea level rise model for saltwater intrusion depend on directing more fresh water through the Everglades.
The assumptions that were used in the salt intrusion modeling were that all of the flows that currently occur continue to occur. And so it did include implementation of, over time, of the Everglades restoration projects, which will actually increase water flows, particularly on the west side of the county, and into the Everglades area. So I guess the short answer to that would be yes, that it did contemplate those things.
Okay, I'm going to see if we can get Neil Grigg on the line here. Neil, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me, Sarah?
Sure can.
Yeah.
Sure can. Take it away.
Well, I'm always happy when this computer thing works. Anyway, Doug, it's a tremendous presentation, a lot of great information, very practical. Having looked at the Netherlands some, you know, they are such leaders in water management below sea level for many years. Looks like what we have here is more complex than what they had, but I just wonder if there's any lessons we can take from them or any communication back and forth between us and them and even other parts of the world that share your problem.
That you were, say again who you were referring to?
The Netherlands, you know,
Oh yeah,
Holland.
the Dutch. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We've had a lot of Dutch engineers over to take a look and share their ideas, and their situation is a little different than ours because they don't have this very porous interface between the groundwater system and the ocean. So, you know, we can't just build a levee or a wall and keep water out because the water would go right underneath it because it is so interactive with the groundwater system. So it's a little bit of a different problem for us. You can do some things with storing water, but our system is so porous that if you put water on the ground, it just goes into the ground and then it spreads out through the whole groundwater system. So it's a real challenging situation.
Well, that is very challenging. Are there any places in the world that have that unique combination of porous underground, large population, and facing sea level rise?
Well, I don't think I really know the answer to that other than to say we're number one on the list.
Looks like it. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, and now I'm going to see if I can get Cambiz on here. Let me see if this microphone thing works. Cambiz, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Sarah. Oh, thank you for your presentation. Great job. I had a question. What are the adaptation strategies you identify for treatment plants in front of sea level rise other than raising the elevation of facilities?
Well, in addition to elevation for the treatment plants, we looked at the idea of actually building a wall. Now, I just said walls don't work, but they do work potentially for storm surge situations. They don't work if the groundwater itself is just rising, because it would rise on both sides of the wall. But if you keep water out of the facility that is coming from a storm surge, that would be helpful. So we looked at that, and we looked at individually hardening particular facilities by putting in watertight doors and making sure that any penetrations through the walls of the facility are properly sealed, and putting up panels and that sort of thing, which I think has been done to some extent, say in New York after Sandy. So that's I think our conclusion is that as you are doing work on these facilities, you really have to use a kind of a menu approach to see what makes sense for a particular application.
Thank you.
Okay, and we got one more question from someone in your neck of the woods there, Doug. I'm going to see if we can get Jess unmuted. Jessica, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can.
Well, thank you. That was very scary yet helpful as always. So I was just, thinking about what you said about the the sort of remaining question about what the South Florida Water Management District might do to manage this sort of disappearing hydraulic head. And so
Right.
what could actually be done if, you know, with this, all things considered, the saltwater intrusion and disappearing head, what are the ideas that are floating, and how realistic are those?
Well, I think probably the first idea is that the canals all have water control structures where they discharge into the bay or into the ocean, and so probably the first thing that will be done, and has been done on a few of the structures, is to add pumps to those structures so that you can actually pump water out of the canal system and thereby lower the water table that is affected by that canal. What I think is not yet known is how much sea level rise could there be that could be effectively mitigated by that kind of an approach. And I'm not aware from a hydraulics point of view that there is another effective way mechanically to address that question. You know, then the issue becomes because the other alternative is just elevating everything in order to allow groundwater levels to get high enough that they can offset saltwater intrusion, and which if you do that now, you end up flooding everybody out. So that's going to be the point of no return. But the South Florida Water Management District is actively, I think, working on that. And in fact, I just saw an article a few minutes ago that they are going to be reporting on a quarterly basis on issues related to sea level rise. So that's a good sign.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we had just a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Yoder, and everybody for tuning in. Please be sure to join us next week when we head up to New York City to learn more about climate resilient water management from Alan Cohn. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and look for the link for this webinar to share with all your friends, hopefully tomorrow.